Welcome, everyone. My name is Victoria Sanchez, and I'm one of the faculty for the CBPR Institute this year. This is the 4th year of our institute, and every year is different, and every year is wonderful, and every year is exciting, and every year is an opportunity to learn and create and engage with many people from many different places. And I wanted to particularly thank this year, as usual, the RWJ Center for, help me out here, Policy at the University of New Mexico. And we have with us the acting director, Dr. Gabe Sanchez, who is no relation to me, but I wish he was. So I'm going to adopt him. We have roots in Las Vegas, New Mexico, so I'm going to call him cousin, primo. Anyway, so again, welcome everybody. I also want to thank everybody else who's here that's not in our institute. I think it's a rare opportunity to listen to one of our own from Cochiti Pueblo who's come up. And the reason I'm introducing Regis is Regis and I went to school together, and I asked Regis, what do you want me to say about you? Because you can see all of his accomplishments on the flyer that you all received. But what you don't know is that Regis and I met in 8th grade, and we were in school, and so we have a long history. So our families knew each other, and it was just a wonderful way to, it's just been wonderful to kind of reconnect and see that change. And we were talking about when we were in 8th grade, neither one of us thought we were going to be here in the academy, speaking, doing research, helping to make change in our community. So it's really wonderful to see Regis in this context. The other thing I wanted to particularly note is that Regis comes from a very special place. Cochiti Pueblo and his culture really are a lot of, it's just a wonderful place, and he's going to talk about it. I don't even have to say anything more. And like many of us, Regis has been on a very different river of life, and his work is really to promote change in his community, his culture. He has multiple identities like many of us, and it's just really my honor and my pleasure, and with great joy do I present Regis Pecos to all of you today.
Thank you, Vicki. What Vicki didn't tell you is when we were in 8th grade, she was my girlfriend. So I'm sorry to embarrass you, but
No, I didn't want to embarrass you.
okay. But I was born in Cochiti, where I have lived all my life and where I plan to be my entire life. And Dr. Sanchez back there, his family lives right across the acequia from where my parents live. And I hope you don't mind me sharing this, but just very recently he lost his grandmother. And as a tribute to his grandmother and the beauty upon which life experiences I've been blessed with really is exemplified by the response of people in our community in such a really special and beautiful way to give honor to Dr. Sanchez's grandmother. But it's that kind of place, and I think communities with that kind of spirit are becoming fewer and fewer. But it's that kind of community where I was born and live and where I've devoted my entire life to that really is the background of what I've done throughout my career. I went to school in Bernalillo and graduated from Bernalillo. And then I went on to do my studies at Princeton University, where I was only one of 6 Indian students in the whole university. if you can imagine that. Did my studies there and really came to fully appreciate the specialness of the place that I came from. Because inevitably two things happen in that kind of life experience, especially at a place where there is that kind of cultural shock, to be one of a very, very insignificant number. Two things happen. One, it either reinforces and reaffirms and validates the beauty and the wealth of both the people from your community, your family, the culture, and tradition. It is a validation or an affirmation of the richness of that society, and that's what it did for me. But it can also have a very devastating effect on people. Devastating because when you make the mistake of trying to compare your self-value with others from another culture, it inevitably becomes very destructive to who you are. And that has always been a major challenge in our life experiences. And before I go any further, I really want to share to all who have been a part of creating this opportunity and really the scope and the breadth of what is being provided in this opportunity for understanding. And I really think that it really can become a contribution to a paradigm shift that is so badly needed in formal education, so that the kind of experience we have in this process really is responsive to the things most relevant and important in our lives for the kind of immediate application as a result of this kind of experience and understanding. Because formal education is not always that way. You go through a process until much later in your life, you create your own process to get back to a place of understanding. In our tribal communities, we call that process re-educating the educated. As a result of what this formal process does to you, to disconnect you in ways that we don't even realize. So, one of the things that was important for me as I served as the Chief Executive Officer for the state of New Mexico's Office of Indian Affairs for 16 years, is that realizing that there were very few Indian people in positions of influence, either within the executive or the legislative branch or within the judiciary. And one of the thoughts in the response to that lack of representation in influential positions of both policy and law was to really look at ways in which we created a process to create opportunities so that those most affected would have a means for meaningful contribution in the articulation of both policy as well as in this process, law as it gets defined by many, many people. And so we founded what's called the Leadership Institute, the New Mexico Leadership Institute. And we looked at from our experiences where throughout this country there were think tanks in existence, to look at how we might replicate such a framework to provide opportunities for analysis, for examination, for reflection, for constructive and progressive responses to the challenges we faced. And we looked at framing such a Native American think tank largely driven and influenced by the way in which we were conditioned to think in that formal education process. So we convened a really diverse group of people. People like my father, who I deeply treasure, as my mother. My mother went to school at St. Catherine's Indian School in Santa Fe. And she talks about the time when Mother Catherine, at the time, would come out from the mother house at Philadelphia with the Sisters of Blessed Sacrament, who founded St. Catherine's and St. Michael's and other Afro-American schools in the country to provide access to education. And she remembers Mother Catherine coming to Santa Fe as a child, and how Mother Catherine would get out of the car and walk from the smallest children to the oldest at at St. Catherine's Indian School. And to think that in her lifetime, she was canonized as is now St. Catherine. Unimaginable, that kind of life experience. My father was a student at the Santa Fe Indian School, and he would laugh to tell the story about being proud that he was a runaway from the Santa Fe Indian School. And he would always talk about running away from home and using the natural landmarks along the way to get home, only to be disciplined when he got home and the next morning be brought back to school. But those were my first teachers. And those are the two people who really embedded in my thinking and in my heart what is the basis of my presentation today. But back to the think tank. So we thought about creating something like the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, or the John F. Kennedy School, or think tanks that are well known throughout this country. So when we convene this group of a really diverse representation from our tribal communities, included was my father, Carnell Chosa, who's from Jemez, his grandfather, and about 10 other folks. And as we went through this whole discussion about our vision, both Carnell's grandfather and my father said, well, you already have a process. You already have a process with which you grew up. If you think about who taught you, and the question of the Leadership Institute is to define a core value that has guided you in your life, in your relationships, a core value that really defines and drives your passion for what you do and what you've done to this stage in your career, is that question that they posed to us. And as we answered their question, we really answered the question about what the vision and mission of this think tank should be. So over the years, now 16 years later, we convene Indian people from our tribal communities across a broad spectrum of issues that are challenging in our communities. Whether it's about land, protecting sacred sites upon those lands, or the loss of language that is very emotional and painful, or whether it's about the changes in our governance system, or the changes within our jurisprudence and customary laws, or about the change in family or community, or the cost and the benefits of something important, necessary, but sometimes very devastating as economic development has been. All of the things that are immediately relevant and challenging in our lives so that people can be in a place, be in an environment for a very frank and honest discussion. And we all know as individuals that sometimes the things we feel most deeply about, that are most immediately relevant in our lives, we can't always talk so frank and honest with family or in a community. So the idea of this Leadership Institute was to create a safe place for that frank and honest discussion. So that as individuals are drawn to engage in their discussion about the most challenging issues in their lives and in their communities, be able to take what we capture in the discussions back to the community to give those people who were part of that discourse an opportunity to talk about the issues, but reflect in a way that this is what 20 other people from 22 different communities are challenged with, and this is how they're responding. And it changes the course of that discussion to not be one that is threatening, to not make people defensive about these issues. So that's what we do at the Leadership Institute. I just saw one of our faculty members, Rebecca Ray, who's been a faculty in our program for many, many years. One of the important parts of this Leadership Institute is what we created that we call the Summer Policy Academy for high school students. So each year we bring about 25 young people into this process. Same process as the adults are engaged in, for the same kind of frank and honest discussion. And you all were engaged in the exercise about the river of life. We use that as part of that experience. And it's so deeply moving in personalizing their life experiences in a way that when you do it in an honest way, you can help but celebrate the resilience of people and the challenges and how they overcome these challenges. The second year, we take purposefully young people out of the nurturing environment. So we have a 2-week course about as intense as yours has been every day with faculty members on all of these major areas that I'll share with you momentarily. We take them in the second year out of that nurturing environment, and we take them to a place that is not so nurturing. We take them to the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, and in that experience, give them the opportunity, one, to see for themselves what it feels like to be in that kind of foreign environment, where the most relevant things that they feel so passionately about doesn't matter to most people in that environment. And it's a real awakening about what it takes to overcome that kind of challenge, to not be devastated by that kind of challenge, but to, one, use that experience to validate and affirm that where you come from, what you are passionate about, matters in ways if you can create an opportunity to strike a balance, to take that richness of that cultural education with a formal education and strike what we call an epiphany, to finally recognize that education can help you respond to these challenges in your community so that you don't go through a formal education process, start a new part of your journey to relearn some things before you feel comfortable and confident that you are contributing in ways that is meaningful. Haven't we all gone through that process where much later after a formal educational process, you kind of redefine or define or redefine yourself and find how it is that you're going to contribute? So our hope is that if we do that much earlier in their lives, that they can really be able to find education as a meaningful life experience, so that education becomes a natural momentum to do well, because you know how education and the skills you develop can be used to make for the kind of meaningful application and contributions in your own life, as well as for your family and community. So that's a little bit about the Leadership Institute, but over 16 years, we have taken several thousand people through that process. Intentionally, we began by creating a critical nucleus to, at some point in this process of our vision, to create a critical mass of people with conscious thinking and understanding to, one, contribute to the ways in which the things that challenge in our lives have to be responded to differently. And so, April of last year, we convened the largest gathering of Pueblo people at a Pueblo convocation to talk about where we've been, where we are, and what kind of future we're going to define for those children yet to be born. It was the largest gathering. It was an incredibly moving discourse about the things most relevant in our lives, with the hope that after that kind of a process of an awakening, that we could plant the seeds that what was an external process drawn from a traditional process could in fact be understood as the means necessary to internalize that process. So now, after that convocation, we did the first Pueblo convocation for Laguna Pueblo, taking the largest number that their facility could accommodate. We capped it at 500 people for 3 days, talking about what Governor Lowarke calls Lagunanizing our Leadership Institute core values paradigm. So what we are doing now is responding to the request of many, many tribal communities to take them through the same kind of a process that begins with an assessment of where have we been, where are we now, and how are we going to be moving forward. So, a final statement with the Summer Policy Academy, and Rebecca's been one of our faculty members, is that we are consciously creating opportunities for young professionals, one, in places that respect their knowledge, to elevate them to levels where the kind of work that they do is affirmed in ways that are fully appreciated. The last part of that process is actually to take your research as a coach with these young people, define a position on issues that are immediately before Congress. So last year, one of the teams did their research on violence against women and took their testimony, as we do with all of the teams, to Washington to present to White House staff, to go before the United States Senate on Indian Affairs, to go to the National Congress of Indian Affairs, to the National Trust, as we did for sacred sites protection, and then have each team visit our congressional delegation to tell their story. And you know, one of the most rewarding responses in that experience is to be asked, or for Senator Bingaman as a senior senator to ask one of our students, will you give me permission to take your testimony to make part of my presentation, to articulate on the floor of the Senate why this piece of legislation is absolutely compelling? Because never have I heard a young person's articulation with regard to that kind of testimonial. It's an incredibly powerful experience, but Rebecca Ray is one of those faculty members and coaches, and we love her for the way in which she inspires young people in that capacity. Where we've been, where we are, and where are we going is really the way in which we begin our dialogue. And so part of where I want to begin as we talk about being healthy is really to go back and share, as Native people, as Indigenous people, one of the most important teachings by our elders. And that is, being healthy is really our heritage. Being healthy really is our way of life. The maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit is really the cornerstone of a defined way of life, as given to us by the Creator. Okay? That is fundamentally the heart of our way of life. And so part of the discussion with regard to health is really to understand by going back and revisiting that gift of the Creator about a way of life and the pathways prescribed for the maintenance of that healthy mind, body, and spirit. Because where we are today in this long journey of life experiences is something that our forefathers predicted would happen. Is that somewhere along our journey through life as a people, that challenges would come about. And if we are not mindful of our collective past experiences at some point along our journey, that we can become our own worst enemy. Deviating from a set of core values as given to us by the Creator is a very special gift to that way of life. And this is where I want to begin to really underscore how deeply embedded these gifts are. As gifts of the Creator is broken down to land upon which there are places of worship. Why would Taos Pueblo, who lost their place of emergence, fight for 60 years for its return if they didn't have the understanding what would be lost? As one of the spiritual leaders shared in his congressional testimony, if we lose this place of emergence, our place of connection, that our people will scatter and become invisible. So why the emotional response to the protection of places like Mount Taylor, to Cerro Blanco, or to San Francisco Peaks, or to Sandia Mountains? Because those are the natural creations of places of worship, of connection, that provides a sense of spirituality for our people as given to us by our Creator. Language is an important gift because language is really the gift that allows us to become and be a meaningful participant in this way of life, to understand our place in this universe and the ways in which we contribute to sustaining and maintaining that gift of a way of life. Former governor from Cochiti Pueblo often reminds, and I'm looking back here to my brother, often reminds us that society, mainstream society, calls that religion. But our elders teach us that it's a defined way of life. Laws and customs are connected to that gift of governance. And this is critical because the governance framework, process, and system is that when you and I have a conflict, that process of governance, using those gifts of customary laws and tradition, is about bringing not just you and I back to good standing with one another, but necessarily engages your whole family and my whole family, and even beyond that. The American governance system and jurisprudence framework is one about individuals. It's a prosecutorial process where the resolution is not between you, but punishment for whatever that conflict was. But it's not about a process of restoring us to good standing for the maintenance of balance and harmony in the community, which that gift of governance and our indigenous customary laws is all about. And so the other part that is an essential piece to that vitality of that society of family, of community, is family. Because family is where we first learn values important in the relationships throughout life. The values that become our core values about love and respect and compassion. The essential elements so fundamental to the maintenance of a healthy relationship throughout. Not just between individuals or within a family or within a community, but with all life that exists that we are just simply a small part of. And so the gift of community is critical because that's where the teachers of core values come from. That's where it is shared for us to understand, to make real our connections to all of the resources that are gifts to sustain us physically, mentally, and spiritually. And so as we move from that circle of gifts of the Creator, we go to that circle of core values. And if we went to each one of you and asked, what is your core value? And who was your teacher? We'll come very quickly to common ground with regard to the spirit of these core values and how they define our relationships with one another. For us, core values is an important tie to bringing to life our responsibility and connections to those gifts of the Creator. And still today, as was the gift of the Creator, is this gift of a traditional calendar that moves from one season, from winter to spring to summer to fall. And in each season are multiple events that take place that is a process of constant validation and reaffirmation and connection to the core values and to the gifts of the Creator. And so an important part of all of that is then the place of prayer. So that when we wake up in the morning and we have thoughts about life and our place, prayer becomes an important part of connection throughout the course of the day as we ask to be guided by a set of core values in all of our interactions during the course of the day. And we verbalize that from thought, from here to here to here. And as we retire each night, we then pray again to reflect on how well we adhere throughout the course of the day to those core values. That is an important part of the maintenance and sustainability of these connections and the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit. And here's just another reflection. In each of us is a spirit. Here's the physical being, but within me is a spirit. And there are concentric circles for the maintenance of that well-being to the most inner spirit. So it begins with an inner spirit within me, with family, with community, but it also is important, one, to understand the nurturing of the entire environment for the maintenance of a healthy spirit and the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit of that individual. So it's another rendition, one, to really make a connection to us as human beings, but within us as human beings, the inner spirit. You either are prayerful and thoughtful in the nurturing of that spirit that guides what we do, that guides our morality, or you can starve that spirit and go about life in ways that I think an old Navajo grandma was once asked, what is the greatest insult in your culture as Dene people? And that grandmother responded, to act in ways as if you had no relatives. Which is why, as Dene people, as Indigenous people, how do we begin in cultural settings or in any setting, right? You go through an introduction that clearly provides for an understanding of who you're related to. That the greatest insult in the Dene society is to act as if you had no relatives. It's a really powerful and profound statement of being, right? That we never go anywhere where we do something that doesn't define our relationships, right? And if that is deeply embedded in you, the personal choices you make, the life choices you make, are driven by your relations. It's a really deeply profound way of life epitomized by something that is so fundamentally basic in being as part of this world. I told you about the teachings that foretold about times where we would be challenged. And one of the first challenges for us is the coming of the colonizers to this region. That really exemplified the threats to the gifts of the Creator of land, of language and culture, of governance, of indigenous laws and customs, of family, of community and resources, right? And when the things that are most fundamentally a part of you is or are threatened, what is the instinctive reaction and response is to become what? Defensive, right? If someone was to hurt your child, you would do everything to protect your child, right? I mean, that's instinctive for all of us. And so, Lieutenant Governor Alvin Warren from Santa Clara, I think, best captured this first challenge when he said that part of Pueblo's survival is the profound ingenious of adaptation. And here in this first challenge is about that adaptation, that without compromising the threats to something important to Pueblo people and society as governance and jurisprudence was in the maintenance of the well-being of their society and communities, was the Pueblo Revolt. And how did they not compromise with that kind of forceful imposition? In order that the traditional governance system would survive, they adapted. That results in a governance structure today that is a balance and a complement of two governance systems. The governance systems created, that the Creator gave to us, adapted to complement that indigenous governance system so that today we still have those leaders that come from the cultural defined elements of our society to governors and lieutenant governors and an overlay of people with that kind of adaptation and complementing effect. That today, the only theocratic governments in the world are Pueblo governments where there is no separation between church and state. And so, with the teachings that there will be many challenges along our journey in life, one of those teachings is that we have to be mindful how to adapt and respond to strike a balance with each challenge. So that is a classic example of what Lieutenant Governor Alvin Warren calls the ingenious adaptation of Pueblo people, so that the gifts of the Creator would not be compromised, but result in a newly created vitality of a spirit unknown to Pueblo people until this challenge came. So over time, I wanted to just use that as a classic example, because where I want to spend the better part of the next 45 minutes is really to talk about what we know best, perhaps, and maybe not, because this formal educational process really doesn't afford us the opportunity in too many ways or in too many places to understand that the challenges we face today are deeply rooted in history. And one of the most powerful countries in this world in order to get rid of the Indian problem, conceived some of the worst policies that more recently the United Nations would define the histories and policies of the United States towards indigenous peoples in this United States as the worst crimes against humanity. And it was about extermination that's either well known or not so well known. It's about genocide. It's about cultural cleansing. It's about removal. It's about the conscious conceptualization to kill a culture. So when there was tremendous public outcry with regard to the failings of extermination, of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, that by 1890, the United States government thought of a more humane policy in its treatment of Indian people. They introduced the policy of assimilation as that most humane way in the treatment of Indian people, using children in an educational process of assimilation. Their mantra was, the way that you kill a culture is to take the children from your culture and deny those children their culture. So that over time, Indian people would become invisible in this society. And so they created, by 1890, boarding schools that took little children away from their families, from their communities. Many stories and accounts of the incredible devastation of these children. And I'll share one quick one with you. A story that a grandmother told from Walatoa in Jemez, that the agents came from the Santa Fe Indian School for her brother. But it was during a time of harvest season where the grandpa needed the grandson to help with harvest. And when the agent told the grandfather and the grandmother, we have to take a child from this family, then the grandfather said, not my grandson, because we're harvesting. And he said, what about my little granddaughter? And so they took the little granddaughter the next day to the acequia to wash her up, to dress her up, and the agents came to take her, to put her on a train to the Santa Fe Indian School, where when she arrived, they undressed her, and she would cry, half-cryingly say, "They took my moccasins, they took my dress that Grandma made me," and then half-cryingly she would say, "But they gave me new shoes and a new dress. They cut her hair." And then she would tell the devastating story that every day she would stand by the window facing south, and every time there was a cloud of dust, she would say, "I hope that's my grandfather coming for me." And then she would cry and say, "But my grandfather never came." And she said in the interview, "Darn him, he gave me away, and that big old grandpa, when they took me, I saw big old tears come down his eyes." But story after story of the devastation that came. I get emotional because in 1990, we did a number of interviews with people from the communities, and they told some really heart-wrenching stories about that time that Dr. Joe Senda would define as a time that wasn't good to be an Indian. And that's how education for us began. And you know what? That defined education has never really been redefined. And you know why I get excited about this approach? Because it's really the beginning of a shift of looking at ways in which we collectively contribute to redefining education for our purposes. But as Indigenous people, what you do at SINA is really to do some things that are important, a contribution in redefining education as it pertains to health that really makes sense for us for the first time since this time. And so that began in 1890. What I'm trying to do here, beginning with education, is to share with you and highlight some things, and I'll move through this quickly. Are all of these different strands with education, with health, with impositions on governance, with impositions on jurisprudence, with impositions that don't end, to think about what are the cumulative impacts with the challenges that we face today that has everything to do with a deviation from the gifts of the Creator for the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit, and the inability and the access to education that could afford us a meaningful contribution in redefining education, our vision and mission, where language and culture is an important part of that vision, so that we can be contributors to the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, spirit in this contemporary world. Because as we move through this whole process, in 1934 was an imposition by the federal government to transform our governance systems. They introduced the Indian Reorganization Act as a way to democratize Indian societies and governments. But we all know the cost sometimes of democratization, right? All we have to do is to turn on the television every morning or every night or the radio, and what do you hear? Is the ugliness of the partisan politics that take place, that has everything to do with winners and losers and who has power and who doesn't, right? So imagine that imposition of this imposed governmental structure that they introduced with an electoral process, different from the traditional governance system, where leaders rise with clear acknowledgement of their maintenance of language and culture, tradition, and knowledge. Where in that process, all members of the community recognize how important that call to service is by committing themselves to support those leaders. Different than the process of an electoral system where there are winners and there are losers, right? And what happens in that process that never heals, because those who lose this time around will do everything until they have the next opportunity to redeem themselves, to win, and eventually assume the power that they're not a part of, right? That's kind of how basic democracy as we know it in this country has become. So in that same period, there was also the beginnings of diminished support for boarding schools. Because by 1928, if you all might Google the 1928 Merriam Report, that really chronicled everything that happened pre-1928. That was the first major document that reflected the devastation of land removal, of language prohibition, of religious prohibition, of detribalization of communities, of breaking up families, bless you, of the loss of resources, right? That was the first major report that gave rise that something different had to happen. So we know in Indian history this phrase that always begins with Congress's articulation, with all good intent, right? For as long as the rivers flow and the grass grows. But we know in that process, all good intent can go wrong when you're not a meaningful part of that process. And guess what? Our history has been countless examples of good intent going wrong. So by 1934, the Johnson-O'Malley Act was introduced. In Indian communities, we know Johnson-O'Malley as what? Number 2 pencils, the Big Chief tablets, and a backpack, right? That's Johnson-O'Malley reduced in terms of what it was meant to be. There was so much criticism because what Johnson-O'Malley really did was to shift the relegation of responsibility for educating Indian children from the federal government to public schools. There was so much opposition. What you had was forced segregation in boarding schools, and now by 1934 and beyond to the 50s, you now were forcing Indian children into forced segregation into public schools. There was so much commotion over that. Tribal leaders would talk about Johnson-O'Malley every meeting they had. And then one grandpa comes and pounds like grandma did before and say, by golly, next time we meet you tribal leaders, you should bring Johnson-O'Malley in here and we can talk to him. As a result of that devastation of forced integration, Vicki, you'll remember in Bernalillo that your most fluent speakers from our communities, those who were deeply rooted in their culture, faced the most racism and discrimination, right? And that was that history from the 40s to the 50s to the 60s on to the 70s. But you know what the lasting impact and legacy of that forced integration is? That when those students became young adults, they became the first generation to consciously decide not to teach their children their language. Because it was so devastating, that racism and discrimination. That was the second wave after boarding school. Because in boarding school, you were prohibited to speak your language. So that was forced, but now you have another major event to now make some conscious decisions about not teaching your children the language. So that went through the 50s or the 40s. Let me just quickly mention that another major event was the wars that the United States were involved with One and Two, Korea, and that conflict, and what it did to take women for the first time out of those communities, to take young men out of those communities, and to see the ugliness of war begin the contribution to this vicious cycle of self-destruction that we still carry today as one of those really critically but least understood intergenerational trauma inflicted upon both women and men that we've never really recovered from. So remember about the cumulative impacts, right? Boarding schools, the impositions of governments, of jurisprudence. Now you have this experience outside your community, far, far away from home, especially for women. There were protections from a cultural perspective for men, but there were not such cultural protections for women, because it was not a consistent part of culture for women to engage in that kind of activity. And so impositions have many layers with these conceived policies by the most powerful country in this world. So as we move from that period, they took the framework of trying to re-engage veterans returning from the war to education and training. So by the 50s, because of the cost of war, as we've seen every major war, that there is a lesser degree of support for domestic programs, right? So this happened by the 1950s. The government decided, well, we can't support Indian people. We can't support their families and their communities and their governments. So now they conceived a whole nother policy. This time, let's just terminate Indians from their legal status. So they terminated hundreds of tribal nations in this country. And then they came up with this bright idea of relocation. If any of you ever saw the brochure of that time, it's a nuclear family on that brochure, with a husband, a wife, a little boy on a red bicycle, a little girl with a little doll with blonde hair and blue eyes, and a beautiful car, a red shiny car in front of the garage. You could have all of that with the relocation program, provided what? You leave your lands, you leave your language, you leave your culture, you leave your family, you leave your community. And you can find the American dream. But guess what happened? It became an American nightmare. And there's that living nightmare that still exists for many people who come to Albuquerque to relocate today. Where do they usually end up? In the worst places, right, that they can afford. And in Albuquerque, it's the war zone in southeast Albuquerque, right? And that really gave birth to the urban population, which now exceeds the numbers on our respective reservations across Indian country. By the 1950s, the government built day schools in our communities about the time that I entered this world. In that day school, there was still the policy that we couldn't speak our own languages in our day schools, in our own communities. But you know who became the enforcers? Our own people. And I share this personal story about one of the most beautiful grandmothers that we all cherish. And in a recent death of this grandmother, beautiful grandmother, one where everybody would raise to sit by grandma because grandma would do this to you, you know? or grandma would do this to you. And that was enough to be in heaven if you sat by grandma, right? We all know beautiful people like that. But in the back of the discussion, in the back of the room was this discussion. Do you remember her when she used to wash our mouths out with soap when they caught us speaking our language? So our own people became enforcers of the worst policies ever conceived that concludes that Indian people or people of color sometimes become the worst enforcers of these kinds of policies, least understood that they become part of something very, very ugly. But that was the case in the 50s in my little community of Cochiti. I'll tell you a quick story. One time we came back from lunch and I saw the teacher and another patron. And they had my little cousin. They had my little cousin surrendered, so we ran over there and we saw my little cousin crying. So my brother asked my little cousin, he said, how come you're crying? Because the teacher told me I couldn't speak Cochiti if I came through those gates. But I was trying to tell the teacher that I crawled under the fence over there. That's a true story. And he had a little rip back here to prove it. So by the 60s, look at, if you just click through that, look at all, this is what, when we first were not that skilled technologically, we used this. And maybe it has a more dramatic impact because it would stretch from this wall all the way over here, Rebecca. And we used to use Gorilla Tape to hold it up. But to really dramatize all of these impositions so that each generation has been challenged with a major policy, potentially or not, purposefully conceived for the ultimate disconnection from the gifts of the Creator. Okay? But that's kind of a dramatization that speaks that when New Mexico became part of the Union, if you can believe, that the Indian Religious Crimes Code was still part of law. That you were not only prohibited from practicing your own religion, but you could be jailed for it. And you know what? That didn't change till the 1970s when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was enacted. The only citizens in the United States that did not have constitutional protections were those people who were here long before there was a United States of America seeking religious freedom. And you know what the Department of Justice defined why we could not have the same constitutional protections? Because our way of life was defined as unorthodox. The same reason that natural places of worship that the Creator gifted to us did not have the same protections as man-made places of worship. Do you think that if Santa Fe were to propose a road to the Santa Fe ski basin and it was going to desecrate some part of St. Francis Cathedral, do you think that that would ever happen? Of course not, right? But the same U.S. Supreme Court in the Lynn decision prevented a road to a major recreational area in California where the local tribal leaders argued that that road was going to desecrate a sacred place. But the U.S. Supreme Court decided in that case that there were no such protections of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. So we still don't have the same protections as man-made structures for Mount Taylor, for San Francisco Peaks, for Cerro Blanco, for Sandillo Mountains, and many other places where there are sacred lands. the rest of society has a linear life experience, to make another point about sacred places. When one moves here and then they're not satisfied, they can pick up and move here. And then in another part of their life, they can pick up, and then they're going to retire over here, and they don't like it, and then they go over here, right? Ours is a circular one, where we come to the same place many, many times for us to be consciously committed that those places must be held in the same manner, with the same integrity, with the same dignity as we inherited for children yet to be born. A major difference in our worldview. And so as we move through this whole process, as they're telling me, giving me notes about the time remaining, let me move just quickly. Here are the federal laws that we call impositions, just to quickly take you through, that impacts land, language, religion, laws and customs, governance, family, community, natural resources. And guess what? The worst laws ever conceived to disconnect indigenous people from all of the gifts of the Creator have not succeeded. Because we can still talk about the lands we're connected to, with a language we're connected to, with a way of life that provides us a sense of spirituality, with governance systems, the oldest in this world, with a jurisprudence, oldest in this world, with the spirit and vitality of family, the vitality of community, blessed with all of the resources as they have been significantly diminished that have sustained our way of life. So as overwhelming as the stories were, there is much to celebrate about the resiliency and the commitment for the maintenance of every generation who have met their test in their time, and because of their unwillingness to compromise, their disconnection from those gifts of the Creator and the core values that bring them to life, that provide for a meaningful maintenance and contribution to a healthy mind, body, and spirit, is the heart of the responses in ways that our leaders, all those who have gone before, have been able to overcome, to answer the question that we always ask, and that is, what will future generations inherit from us? What will your children inherit from you? Essential to that question is that first question earlier about what is a core value that has provided you with a sense of spirit and passion in your life that defines what you do that is meaningful to you. And who were those people who taught you that you will be forever grateful that when you give it to your children and you give it to your grandchildren, you're going to tell them at some point in your life that this was something taught to you by your father or your mother or your grandpa or your grandmother, right? And that's how we sustain over time the most beautiful and essential gifts about the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit. So here are some folks who in their time probably traveled by train all the way to Washington as advocates of their communities in critical times as they traveled weeks at a time to do their part in representing the advocacy on the protection of those gifts of the Creator. So here are all of the gifts of sustenance of the Creator and why we are so intimately connected to all life forms, as the Creator gave us the resources with which to sustain us physically, mentally, and spiritually. And so we celebrate these connections that if you all live here in New Mexico, are many throughout the course of the year, for that constant reminder of connection to all life and celebrating life that has sustained us. So a lot of this is about understanding the impositions of policies, their intent, and how we respond. And so moving quickly so that I can wrap up here, is the maintenance of our connections is really best depicted here. So if you place yourself in the middle where it has us, and you go back and your connection to parents, and you go back to grandparents and your next circle with your great-grandparents. That's very easily generations that equate to 100 years. And it seems like a long time, 100 years, right? But all of these discussions really is a way for us in this discourse really to personalize these life experiences, and the way that it gives understanding to the challenges we face today and how they're deeply rooted in history, that if we know that, we're going to have a major gap in knowing how we break that vicious cycle that interrupts the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit as we answer the question 100 years forward, because we have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and when we go 100 years forward, we're really talking about time that's already here. The decisions we make today is already affecting the great-grandchildren of the future, right? So consciously engaged in decision-making by being conscious about what happens when we are separated from those connecting circles. When we become separated, we become disconnected in ways that is disruptive to the sustainability of connection to place, to core values, and a way of life, right? So if we're not cognizant with regard to how we consciously contribute to maintain contributions to the core values, that teaching I shared with you early about a time along this journey that if we're not mindful of our collective past experiences, that we can become our own worst enemy, right? And sometimes we see all of the ways in which we are becoming our own worst enemy as a clear reflection that we are deviating from prescribed pathways and maintenance of core values. And it's not just in our personal lives that affects families, that affects community. It's in policy making and legislating and laws and designing programs. That if we're not mindful, the integrated nature of education, of health, of social welfare, of the environment, of natural resource management, bless you, and economic development are all interrelated. But we're schooled in ways that create specialties, that separate us in ways that creates isolation from policy making, from decision making. So the question we always ask is, what happens when there is this disconnect? We lose the sense of connection, of a sense of spirituality, a connection to core values, and a disconnection from the people that we otherwise love and cherish because they're the ones who gave us a special gift in this life. Right? So the questions we always ask very quickly, let me just do this. And here's this is where we begin with the discussion today. Traditional medicine, and by 1921, it created two paths or two tracks with the creation of the Snyder Act and the creation of the Indian Health Service system that created facilities external to our communities, but it began to create two tracks of well-being, right? Traditional medicine, Western medicine, but what happens? Two parallel roads and strategies that never converge for the well-being of that beneficiary, right? So in my mind, with all of the unprecedented opportunities that come in this instance with Obamacare, I think the danger of this accelerated process is going to be devastating if we're not conscious. And that is to deviate even more fundamentally from well-being. Western medicine, traditional medicine that still has a very important place and have survived all of the onslaughts. But if we're not careful, we're going to be driven by a business model and an economic model that is going to accelerate the process to disconnect us, because we're going to contribute to the demise of traditional medicine that has at the very heart the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit. So as we move forward, Leah, what we need to be working in all aspects, whether it's education, in development, in health, is this kind of integrated, complementing contribution of strategies for the maintenance and contribution of well-being. And so the questions we always ask as we move, look at all of the chronic illnesses and health disparities, right? You go from one to the bottom, and then let's ask the question, how many of those are self-inflictions? And how many of those self-inflictions are deeply rooted in history? And as we understand that, how can we develop in conscious ways how to break that cycle? And we ask the question, is money, more money the answer? When I served as a trustee at Princeton, Senator Bill Frist was a trustee as well, and he was the Senate Majority Leader. And I would spend countless hours with him about the reauthorization of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. And he told me, you know what, Regis, I sympathize with you, but as long as the United States is in this war, you're never going to get, and you'll never see, appropriate levels of funding for Indian health care. One day of a war in Iraq is equal to the entire Indian health budget. Can you believe that? And so, obviously, Indian Health Service is now funded at 60%. Even with the reauthorization being the largest appropriation of Indian health money, and we're still at 60%, obviously more money is not a political reality, right? So our engaged, conscious discussions is how do we return to our core values at the most fundamental level that has everything to do with a vision of an entire community knowing how to contribute to that vision. And it's not about replicating programs, because here's the classic example of replication that we use. When monies became available and tribes were eligible for Head Start, we didn't consciously ask, where is Head Start a Head Start to? Right? If not, an earlier accelerated process of English acquisition or English proficiency, right? And how is that different when they took little children away from families and communities in 1890 with their assimilationist policy, right? So, conscious decision making across all spectrums, across all strands, has to be about that fundamental question. Are the decisions we're making today supporting our core values? Or are the decisions we're making driving us further away from the core values? And here's an important question added to that. In this time of self-determination, what are we doing differently from those times when we didn't have control and we were critical of? Does that make sense? So, important questions for all of us. What kind of communities do we want where we want to raise our children, our grandchildren, and great-grandchildren? And what barriers stand in the way? And what are we all committed to do to overcome those barriers to reach that desirable place where we want to be a part of in community? It can sound so overwhelming, but you break it down to the smallest unit, and it's so doable. It's simply engaging in very conscious ways and answer to those questions. How are the decisions we're making strengthening our core values, or how are the decisions we're making that is taking us further away from those core values? We cannot just simply replicate programs that we were once critical of, or self-determination doesn't mean anything. True self-determination, if all we are doing is replicating programs we once criticized, I think that equates very fundamentally to self-determination, right? If it's about true self-determination, redefining our strategies and approaches that reinforces our core values is a whole different story to answer the question of what will children of the future inherit from us, and what will be your contribution. So, think about it. Thank you.